When I was a sophomore in high school, a new head coach was hired after the previous coach had retired after about 30 seasons. The prior coach didn't numerically have a successful career with more losses and losing seasons than wins and winning seasons. So, as an underclassman, I was really excited, and so were my peers, about the future of the program. When the new coach was hired, we had a private team meeting as we were introduced to the new coach. And I'll never forget one thing he said that day. He said, "No one here has seniority. Only the best players will play." The idea was that just because this is your last year or you've been on the team longer, that doesn't mean you're going to be a starter. We're not going to have a losing season because you're a 12th grader. No. Only the most talented and effective players will play. Now, there's a lesson in just that part of the story alone. While we should obviously have enormous respect for our elderly and senior citizens, just because they have years and decades of experience in life and in politics doesn't mean they should still be responsible for our highest offices in the country. Let's play the players who are the most talented and effective so that we quit losing games. But again, that's not the point of this story. Because of that philosophy, several players in my sophomore class started playing that very season on varsity. And on top of that, our entire offensive and defensive strategies were changed from the former. We changed the way we did things. Intense workout regimens were instituted. So by the time we were seniors, we were a very successful team, a very effective team. The new head coach had established our new offense as what is generally called the triple option. That is, on the majority of plays, the quarterback has a few options of what he can do with the ball based on how he reads the defense. Now, you have to be a skilled, well-trained quarterback to pull this offense off. And we did. We had a great quarterback. Now, without getting too deep into sports language and all the play calling stuff, the majority of our plays were runs straight up the middle. Our offensive line was phenomenal, and we would punish and exhaust their defense by basically running the same play over and over and over again because it worked practically every time. You're probably familiar with that colloquial phrase, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Well, as long as we were getting 4 or 5 or 6 yards a carry, we kept running the same play because it inevitably wore down our opponent and delivered us the victory. Now, there's something similar happening in our political scene. The calling of the same play, if you will. One cannot deny the fact that a worldwide virus, which shall not be named, helped deliver the Democrats and the liberals electoral victory in 2020. Why do I say that? Because a certain virus gave credence to a massive national push for voting by mail, among other reasons. And by that, I mean mail-in ballots. In several states, and mainly the blue ones, residents across the fruited plains received ballots in their physical mailboxes, even without their request. Now, why do I mention that? Because up until 2020, a citizen of the United States voting by mail would request what was called an absentee ballot. Said person would also have to legally sign their name to an affidavit swearing that I am who I say I am, this is my vote, I can't be at my physical allotted voting location on the day of the election. And all of this was under penalty of perjury. If you were lying, you would be breaking the law. So if you were going to be out of town on a business trip or overseas, or if you were in active military, this is how you could participate in elections. But in 2020, under the guise of a certain virus, absentee ballots became mail-in ballots or mailed-out ballots, and such ballots were shipped out to Americans all over the country. So what's the problem with this? Well, mail-in ballot voting, the mail-in ballot voting process is the system of election that is most susceptible to fraud. Now that's just simply a logical conclusion. The alternative is using the computerized system at a physical location with all the security, and although there's many that believe in the conspiracies of voting machine manipulation, but basically a simple logical conclusion is that ballots placed in people's mailboxes can be abused. However, outside of a simple logical conclusion, there were reports in 2020 of voters receiving numerous ballots for either former residents, like people who lived in the house before them, or deceased family members of theirs, which was all that was blamed on the uncleanliness of voter registration rolls, and voters receiving multiple ballots in their name, voters receiving numerous ballots with their names spelled differently, and on and on. But add to this the long practice from both Democrats and Republicans of ballot harvesting, which is somehow still legal in over 20 states. The ugly truth in this method is that some people just don't care about the election, or they'll take a quick buck in exchange for their ballot, but squads of people just go around picking up these mailable ballots, filling them out however they please. And the vote doesn't authentically represent the person, which should be a federal crime. I don't care who's doing it. Now, there is no question about if this happened, because it's been proven countless times in 2020 and in the past. But rather, the question is to what extent this mail-in ballot system affected the results of the 2020 election. There have only been a few provable situations in which there's direct evidence as opposed to circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is either something like, physical evidence or a confession or a fingerprint, whereas circumstantial evidence is like a connecting of dots that point to certain facts. So while there's a mountain of circumstantial information that one could infer election fraud, there are only bits and pieces of direct evidence, accounts from within the vote counting centers, pictures and security camera footage within those facilities, or, box trucks unloading in the middle of the night or at ballot drop-offs. And if you really want to stretch into conspiracy, we can talk about Dinesh D'Souza's 2,000 Mules. But allow me to simply focus on one set of data as circumstantial evidence, perhaps statistical evidence. In 2016, 128.8 million people voted in the general election. 128.8. 65.8 million voted for Clinton, and 62.9 million voted for Trump. Remember, Clinton won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College, giving Trump the victory. But remember, those two numbers there, nearly 129 million people voted in 2016, and 63 million of those were for Donald Trump. In that election, Trump flipped 6 battleground states, 6, which were critical to his victory: Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida. And in that race, he also won Georgia and Arizona. 4 years later, in 2020, there were over 26.6 million more votes cast in the presidential election. So close to 27 million more votes than 4 years prior. And to add to that astonishment, President Trump received more votes than any incumbent president in history, with 74.2 million votes. That's over 11 million more votes than he got in 2016. 11 million more. But the craziest part is that creepy Uncle Joe somehow got more votes than anyone that has ever run for president. Trump got more votes than Obama did in both 2008 and 2012. But Biden somehow managed to garner the support of 81.2 million Americans. Were these people who just really loved Biden, or they loved his policies or the decades of experience in Washington? Were they just votes against Trump and not necessarily for Biden? Well, that doesn't seem very plausible given the fact that Trump got 11 million more votes than he did in 2016. And I forgot to mention the fact that Obama, on his second election, received less votes by 4 million. He got 4 million less votes in his second election. So just remember that day and think back with me to election night in 2020. The votes were rolling in. States were being called, a lot of them unofficially. Some of us were glued to the newscasts or online updates. And then something strange happened. In 5 states, the counting stopped. Time just stood still. And actually, the vote counting was announced to have been halted until the next day. Now, this is really odd because I couldn't remember a time when something like this had ever happened. I mean, our top 4 most populous states, like where there would be the most voting: California, Texas, Florida, and New York. They all had their election results on election night, which is the way it's supposed to be, legally, according to U.S. Code, Title II, Chapter 1, Section 7. That's been the law since 1934. But anyway, 5 states halted all of their counting overnight. And then the next day, all 5 of those states' electoral votes were awarded to Joe Biden. Listen to the states: Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All states that Trump won in 2016. These are 5 swing states that determined the outcome of the 2020 election. 73 electoral votes. But I'm supposed to believe that Georgia can't total up their votes in one day when the state of Texas, home to 20 million more Americans than Georgia, can wrap everything up before midnight? Now, my theory then, and it's still my theory now, and it's the conspiracy held by many, that there was enough ballot fraud in those 5 states to sway the results of the election. That's the only way people can make sense of the 81 million votes Biden received, the 27 million more votes than 4 years prior, the strange stopping of counting on election night in 5 states, which all coincidentally went for Biden the next day when counting resumed. My point is, all of this is very likely plausible due to mail-in ballot fraudulence. And what was the reasoning? Do you remember what it was all for? What was the source of the prevalence of paper ballots in your mailbox? Public health. Remember? We can't let grandma and grandpa go to the polls. They'll die. We need to keep people safe, so vote by mail. Here you go. Here's a mail-in ballot so you don't catch the virus which shall not be named. And guess what? They're calling the same play again. And why not? It worked last time. They ran the ball right up the middle and scored the victory. So run the same play again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So right on time for the primary debates leading up to the primary elections and ultimately the general, it's back. The Rona is back. CBS News: COVID hospitalizations on the rise as U.S. enters Labor Day weekend. CNN Health: it may be time to break out the masks against COVID, some experts say. NBC Chicago: Illinois Health Department reports rising COVID activity detected in state. LA Times: the pandemic isn't over. ABC News: school districts in Kentucky and Texas cancel classes amid surge of illnesses including COVID. Headline: Lionsgate reinstates mask mandate in parts of Santa Monica office following COVID outbreak. Headline: Dillard University orders masking as COVID cases rise in Louisiana. CBS: Atlanta-based Morris Brown College says they are reinstating COVID mask mandates. Fox, citing rising COVID cases, these U.S. hospital systems have now reinstated mask mandates. Fox again, California high schools cancel football games after COVID outbreaks. On top of these headlines, the Daily Wire reports the following reactions. In Alabama, 3 court buildings in Dallas County have resurrected their mask mandate. In Maryland, an elementary school reinstated its face mask mandate after several students tested positive for COVID. Rosemary Hills Elementary School, just north of Washington, D.C., is requiring the 3rd grade class and school staff to wear masks for 10 days after 3 or more 3rd graders tested positive for the virus. Now, we're 3 years into this social exercise. Initially, we were told to trust the experts and the science, but as time has advanced, the so-called experts have turned out to be quacks, and the science has turned out to be fiction. And we're going to talk about this later in the program, but we can't forget that any objection to the expert analysis was met with suppression and persecution, whether that be doctors and scientists or just average citizens. The things and objections that these so-called experts labeled as, conspiracy have largely turned out to be true. For example, the efficacy of masks. 2 or 3 years ago, any logical person who wasn't thinking through the emotional fear porn and propaganda could easily conclude that the inefficiency of masks against this particular virus. Now, personally, I came up with a brilliant theory that surely will be utilized in scientific labs across the globe because of its genius, but it's known as the flatulence theory. Let's say you're sitting in a room with someone and one person slices the cheese. Now, your distance from said person only determines the delay of time after the crepitation has been secreted, but whether you're 6 feet or 10 feet from the source, the flatuosity eventually reaches your nasal passage. But consider the passage of the gas. The odious wind has penetrated an average of 2 layers of clothing, a double masking, if you will, excreting into a repugnant cloud of hydrogen sulfide and ultimately attaching itself to your olfactory nerve. Now, feel free to cite my flatulence theory if you like. It's making a lot of noise in the science community, but the theory demonstrates the inefficacy of masking and social distancing. Trust me, I've conducted many tests in the last few years. However, others have drawn similar conclusions, including, surprisingly, Michael Smerconish from CNN. Here he is questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci on this very thing.
There is a perception out there by many, how many I don't know, that they don't work and that the data concludes that they didn't work in the first go-round. Respond to that on masks.
Yeah, well, that's not so. I mean, when you're talking about at the population level, that the data are less strong than knowing that if you look on a situation as an individual protecting themselves or protecting them from spreading it, there's no doubt that masks work. Different studies give different percentages of advantage of wearing it, but there's no doubt that the weight of the studies, and there have been many studies, indicate the benefit of wearing masks.
I'm going to refer to one of them. You've heard about it before. I heard about it from a number of radio callers. Brett Stevens in The Times talked about Cochrane. Put that on the screen. The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference. He told the journalist Mayan Damasi, full stop. But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said. Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies. How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual. When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong. But when you talk about as an individual basis of someone protecting themselves or protecting themselves from spreading it to others, there's no doubt that there are many studies that show that there is an advantage. When you took at the broad population level, like the Cochrane study, the data are less firm with regard to the effect on the overall pandemic. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about an individual's effect on their own safety. That's a bit different than the broad population level.
No, there's no difference. It doesn't matter if you're referring to studies of the efficacy of masks on an individual level or a societal level, because individuals make up society. What is interesting, though, is to see a journalist on CNN questioning the great Dr. Fauci, who was the tip of Trump's medical spear in 2020. But I give you all of these news stories and headlines to demonstrate the calling of the same play again. They want to run the ball up the middle again. That they want to use the virus as a way to push and promote the easiest voting process to manipulate. So, are we going to use our same defensive strategy of compliance, or are we going to blitz the middle, knock the ball loose, and score a defensive victory? And by that, I'm describing what the election strategy should be for the average voter. It's one thing for a politician or a state official to have the authority to prevent said processes, but what can the normal person do? What can we do to win? Well, beyond petitioning your local representatives, I think the answer lies in what happened on election night in 2020. Remember, Donald Trump gained more incumbent votes than any president in American history. He got 11 million more votes than he did in 2016. That must have been really surprising to the liberals, given the fact that they berated the man for 5 years, they assassinated the character of the man before and during his time in office, and they likened him to Hitler, the fascistic, genocidal dictator, a million or so times. So it must have been much of a surprise that their standard forms of cheating wouldn't suffice. So they had to put the brakes on, accumulate the necessary ballots that they didn't account for, and the rest is history. The answer there, and the strategy for us in 2024 is to show up. Show up en masse. We need more people to vote than ever before, because they won't be able to inflate the numbers. It won't make statistical sense. So put your game face on, get your teammates ready, and let's defend true American democracy. Getting quality, good-priced meat products is proving to be increasingly difficult these days. With Bidenflation, the prices of everything in store is just going through the roof. When you make fuel more expensive, that costs the farmer more. It costs the shipper more. It costs the grocer more. And it costs you more. That's why you need to check out Good Ranchers. They'll ship directly to your house. They're 100% American beef, chicken, seafood, and pork, all sourced from independent farms in the United States. Check the link in my show notes and use the code RANCHER10 for 10% off. That's the number 10 off their best-selling Ranchers Classic box.